In 1864, a truly disturbing discovery was made. 23 children were found locked away in the basement of a Georgia plantation. Each child shared striking similarities: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, and auburn hair streaked with gold, marking them as kin. When Union soldiers breached the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, what they encountered was a scene of utter despair. These children, some barely 4 years old, others on the cusp of adulthood, were huddled together in the oppressive darkness. The eldest, a girl of 13, spoke words that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened veterans. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." The incident was noted only fleetingly in military records, a single, confidential letter buried deep within the regimental archives of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, where it remained for over a century. Local histories of Burke County, for their part, acted as if Thornhill Estate had simply vanished, as if the plantation and its mistress had never existed at all. But they did exist, in the twisted endeavor that Catherine Thornhill embarked upon. During the 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of Union troops stands as one of the most horrifying chapters in American history. It was a systematic breeding program, carefully designed to create generations of enslaved people who could never escape their bondage, people who were genetically bound to their owner. Before we delve further into the story of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she unleashed in rural Georgia, I need you to do something. If this story is already sending chills down your spine, then hit that subscribe button right now. This channel fearlessly explores the darkest, most unsettling corners of American history, the stories that get conveniently left out of textbooks, the secrets that lie hidden in courthouse basements and forgotten military documents. And I'm curious to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and tell me your state or city. Are you anywhere near Burke County, Georgia? Does your own town have secrets like this, buried deep in its past? Let's uncover them together. Now, let's journey back to the very beginning, to a bleak February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations to come. The winter that Catherine Danforth Thornhill laid her husband to rest was the coldest Burke County had experienced in 2 decades. Thornhill Estate sprawled across 1,700 acres of unforgiving red clay soil, located 7 miles southwest of Waynesboro, the county seat. Back in 1847, Burke County was prime cotton country, although it wasn't quite as prosperous as the Black Belt regions further to the west. The soil here was weary, exhausted by decades of relentless single-crop farming. Plantations that had thrived in the 1820s were struggling to stay afloat by the 1840s, caught in a vice grip of falling cotton prices and rising costs. The Mexican War had drained away laborers, and heated debates over territorial expansion were tearing communities apart. Thornhill Estate had once been one of the more successful properties in the area. Catherine's late husband, Jonathan Thornhill, had inherited it from his father in 1838, along with 42 enslaved workers, adequate equipment, and a manageable amount of debt. But Jonathan was a poor manager and an even worse gambler. By the time a winter fever claimed his life in February 1847, the estate was mortgaged to the hilt. The fields were barely producing enough to feed the workers, and creditors were circling like vultures. Catherine was just 28 years old when she became a widow. She had married Jonathan at 19, a strategic alliance, orchestrated by her father, Theodore Danforth, a prominent merchant in Augusta. The Danforths were old Georgia money, descended from settlers who had arrived in the 1730s. Catherine had been educated by private tutors, spoke passable French, and had been raised with the expectation of managing a substantial household. What she hadn't expected was to inherit a failing plantation burdened with crushing debts and a 16-year-old stepson who looked at her with undisguised animosity. Richard Thornhill was Jonathan's son from his first marriage. His mother had died, giving birth to him in 1831, and Jonathan had remarried 6 years later. Richard had never warmed to Catherine, seeing her as an intruder who had taken his real mother's place. He was a brooding, bookish boy who spent most of his time in the estate's small library, avoiding both his stepmother and the demanding work of running a plantation. Catherine considered him weak, impractical, and far too sentimental when it came to the enslaved workers. He had even dared to suggest that they should be taught to read, an idea so dangerously radical that Catherine had forbidden him from ever speaking of it again. The plantation itself mirrored its declining fortunes. The main house was a two-story structure built in the Federal style back in 1805, constructed of whitewashed brick with 6 imposing columns. Gracing the front portico, paint was peeling from the window frames, and the roof leaked in several places. The furniture inside was a mismatched collection of inherited pieces from Jonathan's family, and cheaper replacements acquired when the finer pieces had been sold off to settle gambling debts. Behind the main house stood the kitchen building, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the overseer's cottage, all showing similar signs of neglect. Further back, beyond a row of ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss, were the quarters where the enslaved population lived. In 1847, just 31 people remained on the property, 11 men, 13 women, and 7 children. 16 others had been sold off over the previous 3 years to appease Jonathan's creditors. Those who remained lived under the constant threat of being sold next. Fear hung over the quarters like a suffocating fog rolling in from the Savannah River. Catherine spent the first month after Jonathan's death in a state of barely controlled fury. She met with the estate's lawyer, Ambrose Talbot, who laid out her options with brutal honesty. She could sell the property and the remaining workers to settle the debts, perhaps leaving her with enough money to live modestly in Augusta under her father's roof, or she could somehow find a way to make the plantation profitable again. A prospect that Talbot considered highly unlikely, given the state of the cotton market and the estate's depleted resources. Neither option was acceptable to Catherine. Returning to Augusta would mean admitting defeat, living as a dependent spinster in her father's house, forever branded as the widow who couldn't hold on to her inheritance. But she also recognized that traditional plantation management wouldn't be enough to save Thornhill Estate. The land was exhausted, the equipment was antiquated, the remaining enslaved workers were too few in number to work the cotton fields profitably, and she had no capital to purchase more. It was during one of these sleepless nights, hunched over the estate's account books by candlelight, that Catherine conceived her plan. The idea came to her with the cold, calculating logic born of desperation. If she couldn't afford to buy workers, she would breed them, but not in the haphazard way that most plantations did, offering minor incentives for couples to have children and then waiting 15 years for those children to become productive laborers. No, Catherine envisioned something far more systematic, far more controlled. She would create a population of workers who were biologically tied to the estate, who could never be sold because they were her own descendants, who would have an ingrained loyalty to the plantation because it was quite literally in their blood. The plan was monstrous, but to Catherine, it also seemed elegant, even brilliant. She was still young enough to bear children. She would select the strongest, healthiest men among the enslaved population and conceive children with them. These children would be raised knowing their parentage would be given slightly better treatment than the others to ensure their loyalty, and when they reached maturity, would be paired with enslaved women to produce the next generation. Within 20 years, Catherine calculated, she could have a workforce of 50 or more, all bound to Thornhill Estate by ties that ran far deeper than mere legal ownership. She began keeping a journal to work out the intricate details. This wasn't some sentimental diary filled with personal feelings. Catherine was far too pragmatic for that. Instead, she created what she called her cultivation records, filled with cold calculations, detached observations, and meticulously detailed plans. She wrote in a simple substitution cipher, replacing key words with innocuous agricultural terms. Children became seedlings. The men she selected became rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. The journal's pages were covered with diagrams that resembled breeding charts for livestock because that was, in essence, exactly what they were. Catherine's first selection was a man named Isaac, 24 years old, born on the plantation, and known for his exceptional physical strength and steady temperament. She summoned him to the main house on a March evening in 1847, after the other workers had returned to the quarters. What happened that night was recorded in Catherine's journal only as first. Planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild. 3 weeks later, she summoned him again, and then twice more before the month came to an end. By April, Catherine was confident that she was pregnant. She recorded this in her journal with the same emotional detachment she might use to note the planting of cotton. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. Richard Thornhill first suspected that something was amiss with his stepmother in late May of 1847. He noticed that she had stopped taking her morning rides around the property, claiming that the heat bothered her, even though the Georgia summer had barely begun. She took her meals in her room more frequently and had dismissed the house servant who usually attended her, preferring to manage her own affairs. For a woman as concerned with appearances as Catherine, this sudden withdrawal was highly unusual. But it was a conversation that Richard overheard in early June that truly alarmed him. He had been in the library, hidden behind one of the tall bookcases, when Catherine met with Miriam Grayson in the adjacent parlor. Mrs. Grayson was the local midwife, a sharp-featured woman of 50 who attended births for both white and enslaved families throughout Burr County. Richard knew her slightly. She had a reputation as a skilled practitioner, but also as someone who asked few questions and kept confidences. "Are you absolutely certain of your condition?" Mrs. Grayson asked in her clipped, professional tone. "Quite certain. I should think sometime in early December." "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said." There was a brief pause. Richard pressed himself against the bookcase, hardly breathing. "My late husband and I were intimate in January, shortly before his final illness." "Of course." Mrs. Grayson's voice carried a note of something, not quite disbelief, but a careful neutrality. "I'll need to examine you properly, and we should discuss the arrangements for the delivery. Will you want me here at the house?" "I will, and I'll need your discretion, Miriam." "Absolutely. You have it, as always." Richard waited until both women had left the room before emerging from his hiding place. His hands were shaking. The math simply didn't add up. His father had been bedridden for the entire month of January, barely conscious most days, racked with fever and chills. Richard had sat with him many nights. There had been absolutely no possibility of intimate relations between his father and Catherine, which meant that the child Catherine was carrying had been conceived after Jonathan's death, in March or April, with someone else. The implications made Richard sick to his stomach. If word got out that Catherine had conceived a child out of wedlock, the scandal would destroy what little remained of the family's reputation. Creditors would immediately move to seize the property. The Danforth family in Augusta would disown her. But beyond the practical consequences, Richard was appalled by the deception itself. Catherine intended to claim this child as her late husband's legitimate heir, to lie to everyone, to build her future on a foundation of fraud. He considered his options. He could confront Catherine directly, but he was only 16, and she held all legal authority over the estate. He could go to Lawyer Talbert in Waynesboro, but without proof, it would be his word against Catherine's, and, as a minor, his testimony would carry little weight. He could write to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta, but Catherine read all outgoing mail from the estate. Instead, Richard began to watch Catherine carefully, looking for evidence, trying to understand what she was planning. He noticed that she summoned Isaac to the main house regularly, always after dark, always when the overseer was away in town or occupied with duties. Elsewhere on the property, he saw how Catherine's manner toward Isaac was different from her treatment of the other enslaved workers. Not kind, exactly, but less overtly hostile. She spoke to him in full sentences rather than curt commands. By July, Richard was certain that Isaac was the father of Catherine's child. The realization filled him with horror, not just at the violation of social and legal boundaries, but at what it revealed about Catherine's character. She had coldly, deliberately chosen to conceive a child with an enslaved man, to claim that child as her late husband's, and to maintain this lie indefinitely. What kind of woman was capable of such calculated deception? He found part of the answer in early August, during one of Catherine's rare trips to Waynesboro. Richard had been searching for legal documents related to the estate. He had vague thoughts of finding something that might give him leverage over Catherine when he discovered a leather-bound journal, hidden in a locked drawer of Catherine's writing desk. The lock was simple enough for a determined 16-year-old to pick. The journal was written in cipher, but Richard had always been good with puzzles. It took him 3 days, working in secret whenever Catherine was out of the house, to crack the basic substitution pattern. What he read made his blood run cold. Catherine wasn't just having an affair with Isaac. She was implementing a deliberate breeding program. Her journal laid it out in chilling detail. Her plan to conceive multiple children with selected enslaved men, to raise those children as part of the plantation workforce, and eventually to breed those children with each other and with other enslaved people to create an ever-expanding population of workers who would be genetically tied to Thornhill Estate and to Catherine herself. There were charts, calculations of expected births over 5-year periods, notes on which men displayed desirable physical characteristics, speculation about whether traits like strength, intelligence, and temperament were heritable. It read like something from a livestock breeder's manual, except the livestock were human beings. Richard copied several pages of the journal, translating the cipher into plain English, his hand shaking so badly that he could barely hold the pen. This was evidence. This was proof of Catherine's depravity. He could take this to the authorities. He could expose her. But that night at dinner, Catherine looked at him with those cold green eyes and said casually, "Richard, have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem to have been disturbed." "No, ma'am," Richard lied, his throat tight. "I keep certain documents locked away for good reason." Catherine continued, cutting her meat with precise strokes. "If I ever found that someone had violated my privacy, broken my trust in such a fundamental way, I'm afraid I would have to take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Because family loyalty is everything, Richard. Everything. Without it, we're simply animals tearing at each other." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know you love your father very much. I would hate for his memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household." The threat was clear. If Richard tried to expose Catherine, she would find a way to turn it back on him, to paint him as a disturbed, resentful stepson inventing lies about a grieving widow. Who would believe an awkward teenage boy with a known resentment toward his stepmother over a respected plantation mistress from a prominent family? Richard returned to his room that night and burned the pages he had copied. But he kept watching Catherine, and he began to feel increasingly unwell. It started with fatigue. By September, Richard found himself exhausted by mid-afternoon, unable to focus on his books. His appetite diminished. He developed frequent headaches that made it difficult to think clearly. By October, he was experiencing muscle weakness and occasional stomach pains. Catherine showed great concern. She insisted that Richard stay in bed. She prepared his meals herself, bringing him bowls of soup and plates of soft foods. She summoned Mrs. Grayson to examine him. The midwife, who also served as a general medical practitioner in the absence of a proper physician, diagnosed nervous exhaustion complicated by possible consumption. She prescribed rest, fresh air when Richard felt strong enough, and a special tonic that Catherine obtained from a pharmacy in Augusta. Tuberculosis often strikes young men of sensitive disposition, Catherine told Richard, adjusting his pillows with a hint of care. "Your father had a cousin who died of it at just your age. We must be vigilant." Richard knew better. He had read about arsenic poisoning during his hours in the library. He recognized the symptoms in himself: the fatigue, the digestive troubles, the muscle weakness. Catherine was slowly killing him, disguising murder as disease, eliminating the one person who knew her secret and posed a threat to her plans. But he was too weak to fight back, too isolated to get help. The house servants followed Catherine's orders without question. The overseer rarely came to the main house. Richard's room was on the second floor, and by November, he barely had the strength to get out of bed, let alone escape the property and reach Waynesboro. He made one final attempt to expose Catherine in late November, writing a letter to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta. It took him 3 days to compose it, working for a few minutes at a time, before exhaustion overwhelmed him. He described Catherine's breeding program, her journal, the poisoning. He sealed the letter and gave it to one of the younger house servants, a girl named Pearl, begging her to post it in Waynesboro without telling Catherine. Pearl took the letter, but she also told Catherine, terrified of what would happen if the mistress discovered that she'd been keeping secrets. Catherine read the letter expressionless, then burned it in the fireplace in front of Richard. "You're very ill, darling. The fever is affecting your mind. You're imagining things that aren't real. It's a mercy, really, that you won't have to suffer much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3rd, 1847, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. Dr. Samuel Pritchard from Waynesboro, summoned to record the death, noted consumption as the cause and remarked that the young man had wasted away with tragic speed. Catherine wept decorously at the funeral. She wore black for a full year. For days after Richard's burial, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son. She named him Jonathan after her late husband and claimed that he had been born slightly premature, which neatly explained away any questions about timing. Few people in Burke County bothered to count backwards from the birth to Catherine's widowhood. Those who did kept their speculations to themselves. It simply wasn't the kind of thing one discussed openly. The years between 1848 and 1856 transformed Thornhill Estate in ways that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. The plantation that had been teetering on the brink of bankruptcy slowly regained its footing. Cotton production increased. The enslaved workforce grew. Catherine Thornhill earned a reputation as a shrewd, if somewhat reclusive, plantation mistress who managed her property with uncommon efficiency. But that efficiency came at a terrible cost that no outsider ever saw. Catherine gave birth 4 more times between 1848 and 1853, daughters named Leliana, Abigail, and Margaret, and another son she called Samuel. Each birth was attended only by Miriam Grayson, who by now was deeply complicit in Catherine's schemes. The midwife received generous payment for her services and her silence, regular fees that far exceeded her normal rates, plus a small cottage on the edge of the Thornhill property where she could live without paying rent. Mrs. Grayson's role extended far beyond delivering Catherine's children. She also performed a darker function, ensuring that the enslaved women on the property only gave birth to children who fit Catherine's careful plans. When pregnancies occurred outside Catherine's controlled pairings, and they did, because human beings will form attachments and intimate relationships, even in the most oppressive circumstances, Mrs. Grayson provided abortifacients, plant-based compounds that induced miscarriages. She performed these procedures in a small room behind the overseer's cottage, away from the main house, away from witnesses. The women subjected to these forced abortions rarely spoke of them, even to each other. The trauma was profound, the grief unspeakable in a system that already denied them autonomy over their own bodies. But whispers circulated through the quarters anyway. Stories of women who had been pregnant 1 week and bleeding the next, who were told that they had simply lost the babies naturally, though everyone knew that Mrs. Grayson had been involved. One woman named Ruth tried to resist. In the spring of 1851, she was 5 months pregnant when Catherine discovered that the father was not the man Catherine had designated for her, but instead a young field hand named Samuel, with whom Ruth had formed a genuine attachment. Catherine ordered Mrs. Grayson to terminate the pregnancy immediately. Ruth ran. She made it nearly 4 miles into the pine forest southwest of the plantation before the overseer's dogs tracked her down. She was dragged back to Thornhill Estate, held down by two men while Mrs. Grayson forcibly administered the abortifacient compounds. Ruth survived the ordeal physically, but something fundamental broke inside her. She worked mechanically after that, spoke rarely, and died 2 years later, during a fever outbreak that swept through the quarters. She was 24 years old, but Ruth's tragedy was just one among many. By 1856, Catherine's program had produced 7 children of her own, all of whom were being raised in a peculiar liminal space. They were legally enslaved. Catherine had registered them as such in the county records, claiming them as children born to enslaved women on the property, which gave her legal ownership of them. But in practice, they lived in the main house, wore decent clothes, ate better food than the other enslaved children, and received an informal education from Catherine herself. Young Jonathan, the eldest, was 8 years old in 1856. He was a serious, quiet child who resembled Catherine strongly. The same green eyes, the same auburn hair, the same sharp features. He had no memory of his father, Isaac, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1849. Catherine had found Isaac's presence a complication once. His purpose had been served. The money from his sale helped pay down some of the estate's remaining debts. The younger children knew nothing of their true parentage. Catherine told them that they were fortunate orphans whom she had taken into her household out of Christian charity. She taught them to read and write, a dangerous illegality in Georgia, where teaching enslaved people literacy was prohibited by law. But Catherine was confident that no one from the outside would ever enter her home and discover what she was teaching these children. She was grooming them, preparing them for the next phase of her plan. But that phase required patience. The children needed to reach physical maturity before they could be used for breeding. Catherine continued her meticulous record-keeping, tracking their growth, their health, their temperaments. She noted which children showed physical strength, which seemed more intelligent, which were more compliant. She was planning pairings decades in advance. In the meantime, she continued having children of her own. 3 more were born between 1854 and 1856, sons named William and Henry, and a daughter called Caroline. Each had a different father, carefully selected from among the enslaved men on the property. Catherine's criteria were ruthlessly practical: physical health, strength, decent teeth, good eyesight, no obvious impairments. She cared nothing for their personalities or characters. They were simply, in her mind, genetic material to be utilized. The men themselves had no choice in the matter. When Catherine summoned them to the main house, they came knowing that refusal meant brutal punishment or being sold off. Some of them were aware of the situation. The children Catherine bore would be their own offspring. Yet these children would be raised to see Catherine as their savior and benefactor. The psychological strain was immense. They were being forced to father children they could never claim, never nurture, never protect. In 1855, a man named Thomas was called to the main house. He was 27, married to Hannah, who lived in the quarters. Hannah was carrying their first child. Thomas tried to refuse when he learned Catherine intended to use him for breeding purposes. Virgil Kane, the overseer, a man known for his brutality, had Thomas whipped in front of the other enslaved people, 39 lashes that left his back scarred for life. Afterward, Catherine had him brought to the main house anyway. Thomas complied, knowing he had no choice. He never spoke to Hannah about what occurred, and Hannah never asked. Some knowledge was simply too toxic to speak aloud. By 1856, Thornhill Estate had a population that seemed normal on the surface, but its structure was based on Catherine's perverse logic. There were the field workers, around 20 adults and their children, who toiled in the cotton and corn fields under the overseer's watch. There were the house servants, 3 women and an elderly man, who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the house. Then there were Catherine's special children, 10 in all by 1856, ranging in age from 8 years old to infancy. These children occupied a strange place in the plantation hierarchy. The other enslaved people resented them for the privileges they received, but also pitted them for what they represented. Everyone in the quarters understood, at least on some level, what Catherine was doing. They didn't have the language of eugenics or breeding programs. Those terms would come later, but they recognized the pattern. They saw how Catherine kept detailed records of the children, how she measured them regularly, and how she noted their development in her locked journal. They waited with a kind of horrified dread to see what would happen when these children grew up, because everyone knew Catherine's intentions. She had made them clear in subtle ways, through comments and instructions. These children were being raised to produce the next generation of workers. They were tools in Catherine's long-term plan to create a workforce that could never leave, that could never be sold, because they were genetically tied to her and to Thornhill Estate. It was an abomination disguised as innovation. However, in the isolated world of a rural Georgia plantation in the 1850s, with no outside scrutiny and all the power held by the property owner, Catherine was free to pursue her vision without interference. The only person who posed a potential problem was Lawyer Talbot in Westboro, who handled the estate's legal affairs and therefore had access to records that might raise concerns. But Talbot was a pragmatic man who valued profitable clients, and by 1856, Thornhill Estate was becoming profitable. The cotton yields were improving, the workforce was growing through Catherine's breeding program at no cost, and debts were being paid down. Talbot asked no difficult questions because he benefited from Catherine's success. The plantation's isolation helped maintain secrecy. Thornhill Estate was 7 miles from Westboro, connected by a rough road that was often impassable in winter. Neighbors were scarce. The nearest plantation was 3 miles away. Catherine rarely entertained visitors and discouraged social calls. When she did interact with other plantation families, typically at church on Sundays or at occasional gatherings in Westboro, she presented herself as a respectable widow, managing her late husband's property with Christian virtue and practical wisdom. No one suspected the systematic horror unfolding behind the whitewashed brick walls of the main house and in the quarters beyond the oak trees. Even if they had suspected, would they have cared? This was Georgia in the 1850s, a society built on the brutal exploitation of enslaved labor. Catherine's program was more systematic and coldly calculated than most, but it wasn't fundamentally different from what was happening on thousands of other plantations across the South. That was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire situation. Catherine's breeding program was monstrous, yet it was also logical within a society that already treated human beings as property to be bought, sold, and bred at will. She had simply taken the underlying logic of slavery to its most horrifying conclusion. But systems built on such profound injustice contained the seeds of their own destruction. Change was coming to Georgia and the entire South, though in 1856, few could imagine how soon or how violently it would arrive. The late 1850s brought increasing tensions to Burke County and all of Georgia. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories dominated national politics. The violence in Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were literally killing each other, was discussed in anxious tones at the courthouse in Westboro. The presidential election of 1856, which put James Buchanan in office, did little to resolve the fundamental conflicts tearing the country apart. Catherine paid little attention to politics. Her focus remained on Thornhill Estate and her long-term program. By 1859, her eldest children were approaching adolescence. Jonathan was 11, Elenina was 10, and Abigail was 9. They were still too young for the breeding phase of Catherine's plan, but she was already making preparations, already selecting which of the enslaved young women would be suitable partners when the time came. It was during this period that Catherine built what she called the Heritage Room in a previously unused section of the mansion's east wing. She told the house servants it would be a storage space for family records and memorabilia. In reality, it was a shrine to her breeding program. The room was windowless, lit by oil lamps, with walls lined with shelves, and a large table in the center. On the shelves, Catherine stored her coded journals, 3 leather-bound volumes by 1859, chronicling every birth, every pairing, every observation about the children's development. She also kept small glass vials, each labeled with a name and a date, containing locks of hair from each child. These samples were arranged in rows organized by generation and parentage, a physical archive of her genetic experiments. On the table, Catherine had drawn elaborate family trees in ink, showing not actual family relationships, but her planned pairings for future generations. Lines connected names with notations about anticipated outcomes, strong constitution, good teeth, intelligent, compliant temperament. It looked like breeding charts for show dogs or racehorses, except the names were human. Abigail paired with Thomas's son, Jacob. Elenina with Isaac's son, Marcus, who would be born in 1862. Margaret with Samuel's nephew, Peter. Catherine spent hours in this room planning decades into the future, imagining a Thornhill estate populated by 100 or more workers, all descended from her, all genetically and psychologically bound to the land. In her mind, she was creating something revolutionary, a plantation that would never face labor shortages, never require expensive purchases of new workers, never risk mass escapes because the enslaved population would have nowhere else to go. They were family in the most literal sense. To realize this vision, Catherine had to exert even tighter control over the plantation's social structure. She started separating the children into different groups based on their roles in her program. The special children, her own biological offspring, continued to live in or near the main house. The other enslaved children were kept at a distance, sleeping in the quarters and working in the fields as soon as they were old enough. But Catherine needed these other children, too. They were necessary for the genetic mixing she envisioned. So she implemented a system of subtle manipulation, offering small privileges to families who cooperated with her pairings, and threatening separation and sale to those who resisted. The psychological pressure was immense and constant. A woman named Violet, mother of 3, found herself in an impossible situation. In 1860, Catherine decided that Violet's eldest daughter, Sarah, a girl of 14, should be paired with one of the older field hands, a man in his 30s named Elijah. Sarah was terrified. She was still a child, and Elijah was old enough to be her father. Violet begged Catherine to wait, to give Sarah more time. Catherine's response was cold. "You have 2 younger daughters, Violet. Would you prefer I sell them to settle this matter, or will Sarah do her duty to this estate and to you?" Sarah was paired with Elijah that autumn. 9 months later, she gave birth to a daughter and died from complications of the delivery. She was 15 years old. Violet never recovered from the loss. She continued working mechanically, speaking to no one, and in 1862, she walked into the Savannah River and drowned herself. But tragedies like Sarah's and Violet's were invisible to outside observers. When visitors came to Thornhill Estate, which was rare, they saw a well-managed plantation with neat fields, a substantial house, and a workforce that appeared adequately fed and housed. The horror was carefully hidden, buried in the quarters, locked in the heritage room, and encoded in Catherine's journals. Then came 1860, and everything changed. Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December. Georgia followed in January 1861, with delegates at the secession convention in Milledgeville voting 208 to 89 to leave the United States and join the Confederate States of America. War came in April with the firing on Fort Sumter. Initially, many Georgians believed it would be a short conflict, a few months, maybe a year, and the Confederacy would win its independence. But the war dragged on through 1861, into 1862, and through 1863. Young men from Burke County marched off to fight in Virginia and Tennessee. Some returned in coffins. Others didn't return at all. The war disrupted Catherine's plans in ways she hadn't anticipated. The overseer, Virgil Kane, enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1861 and was killed at Shiloh in April 1862. Finding a replacement was difficult. Most able-bodied white men were away at war. Catherine eventually hired an elderly man named Silas Kendrick, who was too old for military service. Kendrick was less brutal than Kane had been, but he was also less effective at maintaining discipline and control. The enslaved population at Thornhill Estate began to sense the shifting power dynamics. News filtered through the slave networks that connected plantations across Georgia, whispered reports of Union victories, rumors that Lincoln had issued a proclamation freeing enslaved people in Confederate territory, speculation about what would happen if the Yankees came south. Catherine tightened her control as best she could. She confined the enslaved population to the plantation, forbidding anyone from leaving, even to visit relatives on neighboring properties. She increased rations slightly to reduce the temptation to run away, and she accelerated her breeding program, pushing some of the children into pairings earlier than she had originally planned. Jonathan, her eldest son, turned 15 in December 1862. Catherine decided he was ready. She had selected a young woman named Rachel, 16 years old, the daughter of one of the field hands. Rachel had no say in the matter. In February 1863, Catherine arranged for Jonathan and Rachel to be married in a ceremony she conducted herself in the main house, a mockery of a wedding with no legal standing, designed purely to give a veneer of respectability to the breeding pairing. Jonathan, who had been raised in isolation from the other enslaved people and taught to think of Catherine as his benefactor, accepted this arrangement without question. He had no understanding of what had been done to him, no awareness that Catherine was his biological mother, no sense of the profound wrongness of the entire situation. Rachel, traumatized into silence, said nothing, but others in the quarters were watching. They saw Catherine pairing these special children, the ones she'd raised in the main house, with the other enslaved young people. They understood this was the next phase of whatever Catherine had been planning all these years, and a quiet, desperate rage began building in the quarters, a rage that would have nowhere to go until circumstances finally shifted in their favor. The spring of 1863 brought terrible news to Burke County. Confederate losses were mounting. The Union Army controlled the Mississippi River after the fall of Vicksburg. In July, Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania ended in disaster at Gettysburg. Shortages of food, cloth, and basic supplies made life increasingly difficult, even for white plantation families. For the enslaved population, conditions became harsher still as Catherine rationed everything more severely. But something else was happening at Thornhill Estate, something Catherine tried desperately to hide from the outside world. The children she'd been breeding and raising were becoming aware of their true parentage. It began with Elenina, Catherine's second-born daughter, now 14 years old. She had always been the most observant of Catherine's children, the one who asked uncomfortable questions. In May 1863, while helping Catherine organize papers in the study, Elenina found one of the coded journals that Catherine had carelessly left unlocked. Elenina had learned to read from Catherine herself. She was intelligent, curious, and bored with the limited reading material available in the house. The journal's cipher intrigued her. She spent 3 weeks working on it in secret, the same way Richard had done 16 years earlier, slowly decoding the substitution pattern. What she found destroyed her understanding of her entire existence. The journal detailed her conception. Second planting with rootstock 2. Thomas, age 21. Excellent physical specimen, strong back, good teeth, weather warm and humid. Anticipate harvest in late October 1848. Elenina read the entry again, and again, her hands shaking. Rootstock 2. Thomas. She knew Thomas. He was one of the field hands, a quiet man in his 30s who never made eye contact with anyone. He was her father. Catherine was her mother. She was not an orphan raised out of charity. She was the product of Catherine's deliberate breeding experiment. The implications crashed through Elenina's mind. If this was true for her, it was true for Jonathan, for Abigail, for all the children Catherine had brought into the main house. They were Catherine's biological children, conceived with enslaved men, and they had been lied to their entire lives. Worse still, the journal laid out Catherine's plans for their futures. Elenina read the notations about pairings, about anticipated offspring, about the creation of a self-sustaining workforce. She saw her own name in one of the charts connected by a line to someone called Marcus, Isaac's son, to be born 1862, pairing with Elenina. Anticipated 1865. Elenina felt physically sick. Catherine intended to pair her with a boy who hadn't even been born yet, to force her to have children who would be enslaved on this plantation forever, to turn her into another breeding tool in this nightmare system. She confronted Catherine that night, her voice shaking with rage and horror. I read your journal. I know what you are. I know what I am. Catherine's face went still, her eyes cold as winter. You should not have done that, Elenina. You're my mother. Thomas is my father, and you've been planning to breed us like animals. Elenina could barely get the words out. Sit down, Catherine commanded. No. The threat in Catherine's voice was unmistakable. Elenina sat, her whole body trembling. Catherine paced the room, her mind clearly working through the problem Elenina now represented. Finally, she spoke. You are intelligent enough to understand the position we are in, so I'll speak plainly. Yes, I'm your biological mother. Yes, I've been implementing a systematic program to create a self-sustaining workforce for this estate. And yes, you and the others will participate in that program when you come of age. I won't, Elenina said, but her voice lacked conviction. You will, because the alternative is far worse. Catherine leaned forward, her face inches from Elenina's. Right now, you live in this house. You eat good food. You wear decent clothes. You can read and write. What do you think happens if you refuse to cooperate? I sell you. I sell you to a plantation in Alabama or Mississippi where they work field hands to death in 5 years, where women are brutalized as a matter of course, where literacy earns you a whipping or worse. Is that what you want? Elenina said nothing, tears streaming down her face. I thought not. Catherine straightened. You will not speak of this to your brothers or sisters. You will not speak of it to anyone in the quarters. You will continue your life exactly as before. And when the time comes for you to fulfill your role in this family's future, you will do so. Do you understand? Yes, Elenina whispered. But Catherine had made a critical error. She had revealed the truth without adequately controlling the information. Elenina did speak to others. Not immediately, but gradually, carefully. She told Jonathan first, showing him the journal entries she had memorized. Jonathan's reaction was different from Elenina's. He had been so thoroughly conditioned by Catherine, so completely isolated from any alternative framework for understanding the world, that he struggled to see what was wrong with Catherine's plan. She gave us a better life, Jonathan said, confused by Elenina's anger. We could have been working in the fields. Instead, we're here. We're property, Jonathan. We're slaves. Our own mother enslaved us. She's protecting us. She's keeping us together. If we were sold, we'd be separated, sent to different places. This way we stay together. We stay at Thornhill. Elenina realized with horror that Catherine had been too successful in her indoctrination. Jonathan couldn't see the cage Catherine had built around all of them. But Abigail, 13 years old and sharp as a tack, understood. Immediately when Elenina told her, and Margaret, at 12, understood too. The younger children were still too young to fully grasp it, but the older ones they knew now. They knew what they were, and what Catherine intended for them. The knowledge changed the atmosphere in the main house. Catherine felt it, that shift in the air, the way her children looked at her. Now there was fear, yes, but also something else, calculation, waiting. They were biding their time, and Catherine knew it. She considered her options. She could sell the older children, eliminate the problem, but that would waste years of investment and planning. She could punish them severely enough to break their spirits, but physical brutality might damage them in ways that would interfere with the breeding program. She needed them healthy, capable of bearing children. So, Catherine chose a different approach. She would demonstrate the consequences of disobedience through someone else. In August 1863, a young woman named Grace tried to run away from Thornhill Estate. She was 17, pregnant, and desperate. She had been paired with one of the field hands against her will, and she couldn't bear the thought of bringing a child into this system. She ran at night, heading east toward the Savannah River, hoping to somehow cross into South Carolina and from there make her way to Union lines. She was caught within 12 hours. The dogs tracked her to a creek 3 miles from the plantation. She was brought back, locked in one of the outbuildings, and the next morning, Catherine assembled everyone, all the enslaved people, including her special children from the main house, in the yard between the quarters and the mansion. Grace was brought out, her hands tied. Catherine stood on the porch of the main house, her face expressionless. This woman attempted to abandon her responsibilities to this estate and to all of you. She attempted to destroy the family we have built here. The penalty for such betrayal must be severe. What followed was brutal. Grace was whipped publicly, 20 lashes administered by the elderly overseer Kendrick, who carried out the punishment with grim reluctance. Catherine made all the children watch, including her own biological offspring. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who try to leave. But Catherine had miscalculated again. The public punishment didn't terrify the enslaved population into submission. Instead, it clarified something for them. Catherine was willing to use extreme violence to maintain her control, which meant she was afraid. And if she was afraid, that meant they had more power than they'd realized. Whispers began circulating through the quarters in the weeks that followed. Whispers about waiting for the right moment. Whispers about what would happen when the war ended, because surely it would end, and surely the Yankees would come south, and surely things would change. All they had to do was survive until then. Elenina heard these whispers. She began spending time near the quarters when Catherine wasn't watching, developing relationships with the other enslaved people. She had been kept separate from her entire life. She learned things Catherine had never told her, about her father, Thomas, about the other men Catherine had used, about the women who had died or been broken by Catherine's program. One evening in October, Elenina met with a group of the older enslaved women in the woods beyond the quarters. They sat in a circle, in the darkness, speaking in low voices. A woman named Hope, in her 40s, looked at Elenina with something between pity and respect. "Your mama, she thinks she made something special here," Hope said quietly. "Thinks she made family, but all she did was make people who hate her in ways she can't even understand." "What happens when the war ends?" Elenina asked. "Depends on who wins," Hope replied. "Yankees win, we're free. Confederates win, things stay the same or get worse. But either way, your mama can't keep doing what she's been doing. Too many people know. Too many people angry. Something's got to break. What if we made it break?" Elenina asked. The women looked at her in surprise. Hope leaned forward. "What you saying, child? What if we didn't wait for the war to end? What if we ended this ourselves?" The idea hung in the air, dangerous and intoxicating. One of the younger women, Anna, spoke up. "You talking about running? Taking everyone and running or fighting? There's only Mrs. Catherine and old Mr. Kendrick. There are 40 of us, and 20 of them are children," Hope said practically. "And where are we going to go? Confederates catch runaways. They kill us or sell us further south. And you? You think they're going to see you as one of us or one of them?" The question stung because Elenina didn't know the answer. She was Catherine's daughter. She had grown up in the main house. She could read and write. Her skin was lighter than most of the people in the quarters. Would they even accept her if things came to violence? Before Elenina could respond, they heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Everyone scattered, melting into the darkness. Elenina ran back toward the main house, her heart pounding, wondering if someone had heard their conversation, if Catherine would find out, if everything was about to collapse. But no punishment came. The next day passed normally, and the day after that. It seemed they had escaped detection, but the seed had been planted, the idea that they didn't have to passively wait for external forces to free them. They could act themselves. That idea began spreading through the quarters like a fever. Catherine sensed the change, but couldn't identify its source. She increased her surveillance and had Kendra patrol the quarters at night. Her intensified restrictions on movement ratcheted up the tension at Thornhill Estate week after week. It felt like watching a storm gather strength on the horizon. The dark clouds massing, the very air crackling with electricity, everyone bracing for the inevitable lightning strike. The break finally came in March of 1864, though not as anyone anticipated. A detachment of Confederate cavalry rode through Burke County, commandeering supplies from the plantations, food, horses, cloth, absolutely anything that could be of use to the war effort. Catherine had no option but to comply. She turned over corn, preserved meats, and 2 of the plantation's finest horses. The soldiers only stayed the night, setting up camp in the fields beyond the slave quarters, and then were gone at dawn. But their brief presence left an indelible mark. The soldiers spoke freely about the war's progress, and the news was grim for the Confederacy. Sherman was relentlessly pushing through Georgia. Union forces were converging from all sides. Some soldiers spoke with a sense of resignation, as if the war was already lost, talking about heading home, about how they simply couldn't sustain the fight for much longer. Every single word of this reached the ears of the enslaved people at Thornhill Estate. A tidal wave of hope washed through the quarters. Freedom was on its way. It might still be months, or maybe just weeks, but it was definitely coming. All they had to do was hang on just a little bit longer. Catherine, acutely aware of this burgeoning hope and utterly terrified of what it spelled for her carefully laid plans, resolved to take decisive action. If the Confederacy crumbled, if the enslaved population gained their freedom, then everything she had meticulously built would come crashing down. Her special children would leave. Her breeding program would be over. 16 long years of relentless work would amount to absolutely nothing. She simply couldn't allow that to happen. On the night of March 17th, 1864, Catherine summoned her biological children to the main house. Jonathan, Ellen, Abigail, Margaret, Samuel, William, Henry, Caroline, and the 3 youngest, still infants, 11 children in all, their ages ranging from 16 years down to just 6 months old. Things are about to undergo some major changes very soon, Catherine told them, her voice deceptively calm, but her eyes burning with intensity. The war may take a very bad turn for us. The Yankees might be coming. There could be attempts made to take you away from me, to tear our family apart. And I simply cannot let that happen. Elena felt a shard of ice lodge itself in her spine. What are you planning to do? We're going to secure our future tonight. She led them to the Heritage Room in the East Wing, a room that none of them, with the exception of Jonathan, had ever been allowed to enter. Catherine lit the oil lamps, casting a harsh light on the shelves crammed with journals, the vials filled with hair samples, the elaborate family trees painstakingly drawn on paper and pinned to the walls. This is our legacy, Catherine declared. This is what we've all built together, and no one is going to take it away from us. From a locked cabinet, Catherine produced a small wooden box. Inside lay several glass bottles filled with a clear liquid. This is a medicine. It's called laudanum. In small doses, it provides relief from pain. But in larger doses, it offers eternal peace. Abigail gasped. You're planning to poison us. I want to protect you, Catherine corrected, her voice taking on a desperate edge. If the Yankees come, if they free the others, where exactly will you go? You're not white enough to fit into white society, and you're not fully black in their eyes either. You'll be outcasts, owned by nobody, belonging nowhere. Is that really better than staying here, staying together, staying with me? Yes, Elena said firmly. Anything would be better than this. Catherine's face hardened into a mask. You're too young to understand. All of you are too young. But I am your mother, and I know what is best for this family. She reached for the bottles, but Jonathan stepped directly between her and the others. At 16, he was nearly as tall as Catherine, and something in his face had changed, hardened. "No," he said quietly but with conviction. "Jonathan, don't be so foolish. You understand the plan. You've always understood." "I understood what you told me," Jonathan replied, his voice shaking slightly. "But Elena showed me the journals. I read what you wrote about us, about Father Isaac, about Father Thomas, about all of them. I know what you did. I know what you are. I am your mother," Catherine exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. "You're a monster," Jonathan said, and his voice cracked on the final word. Catherine lashed out, slapping him hard across the face, a sharp crack that echoed in the small room. "How dare you? After everything I've given you, after everything I've sacrificed." "You sacrificed nothing," Elena said, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Jonathan. "You used people. You destroyed them. You destroyed us." Catherine stared at her children, really seeing them, perhaps for the first time. They were united, a solid wall against her. Even the younger ones, who didn't fully grasp what was happening, sensed the gravity of the confrontation, and stood with their older siblings. She had lost them. In that instant, Catherine made a final, desperate decision. If she couldn't keep her children, if they were going to reject her and abandon her and destroy everything she had worked to build, then she would at least preserve the record of what Catherine Thornhill had created. Future generations would know the scope of Catherine Thornhill's accomplishments, even if the creation itself had ultimately failed. She snatched up the journals, the charts, the vials of hair samples, clutching them tightly to her chest. "You think you can escape me? You think you can just pretend that none of this ever happened? These records will survive. They will prove what I built here. They will prove that I was right all along." She shoved past her children and fled from the room, carrying with her the physical evidence of her horrific crimes. Jonathan and Elena gave chase, but Catherine, fueled by manic energy, was faster. She raced through the main house, out the front door, across the yard, heading straight toward the slave quarters. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. The subsequent testimonies would be riddled with contradictions, each person remembering the events with slight variations, their recollections inevitably colored by their own trauma and perspective. What is undeniably certain is that Catherine reached the slave quarters, still clutching her journals and specimens. What is equally certain is that the enslaved population, roused by the commotion, poured out of their cabins to witness the mistress who had tormented them for 16 long years running toward them in the darkness, clutching the evidence of her depravity. What is absolutely certain is that someone, maybe Hope, maybe one of the men, maybe several people all at once, decided that this was the moment. This was when it all came to an end. Catherine Thornhill vanished that night. Her journals were discovered scattered in the mud outside the slave quarters, the pages torn and soiled. The vials of hair samples were smashed to pieces. The charts were burned to ashes. And Catherine herself was simply gone, without a trace. Jonathan and Elena, arriving at the quarters just minutes after their mother, found absolute chaos. People were shouting, running in every direction, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke from a fire someone had started to burn Catherine's papers. "Where is she? Where's Catherine?" Jonathan demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and anger. Hope stared at him with an inscrutable expression, one he couldn't even begin to decipher. "Gone. That's all you need to know. She's gone, and she ain't ever coming back." "What did you do to her?" Jonathan demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "She got where she had coming," Hope said simply. "Now, you got a choice to make, boy. You can raise hell about your mama, but you also got to understand that justice was served here tonight, and you can just let it rest." Jonathan turned to Elena, searching her face for guidance. His sister's face was deathly pale, her eyes wide with shock, but she nodded slowly. "Let it rest," she whispered. The next morning, Catherine Thornhill was reported missing. Old Mr. Kendrick, the overseer, conducted a thorough search of the property, but found absolutely nothing. He reported the disappearance to the sheriff in Westboro, who came out to investigate, but ultimately concluded that Mrs. Thornhill had likely fled the area in fear of the advancing Union forces. It was a reasonable assumption, given the rapidly deteriorating military situation. No one from the slave quarters breathed a word of what had transpired. Jonathan and Elena and the other children said absolutely nothing. The official record merely states that Catherine Thornhill disappeared on the night of March 17, 1864, and was never seen again. But everyone at Thornhill Estate knew the truth, even if they never spoke it aloud. Catherine had been killed that night. Her body had been disposed of somewhere on the plantation's vast 1,700 acres. And her children, her own biological offspring, the products of her twisted breeding program, her so-called legacy, had chosen to let their mother's murderers go unpunished because they all understood, deep down, that their mother had earned her fate. The war finally ended 15 months later. General Sherman's army swept through Georgia in late 1864, though they passed some 30 miles north of Burke County and never came directly to Thornhill Estate. The Confederacy ultimately collapsed in April 1865. Freedom came to the enslaved population of Georgia through a confluence of factors: military occupation, the passage of the 13th Amendment, and the simple, undeniable fact that the barbaric system of bondage could no longer be sustained. At Thornhill Estate, the transition was undeniably complex. Jonathan, as Catherine's eldest child, possessed some legal claim to the property, but his status was inherently ambiguous. Legally enslaved under Georgia law, but also Catherine's biological heir. A lawyer named Talbot in Westboro attempted to untangle the mess, but eventually threw up his hands in defeat. The property fell into a kind of legal limbo, suspended between worlds. Most of the formerly enslaved people left Thornhill Estate within weeks of emancipation. They scattered across Georgia and beyond, searching for family members who had been sold away years before, seeking new opportunities in cities, or simply putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the horrific memories of their suffering. Some remained, at least initially. Hope stayed on, helping to organize those who had nowhere else to go. Thomas stayed, too, Elena's biological father, who finally, after 16 long years, was able to acknowledge his daughter openly. They had a single conversation about Catherine, about the unspeakable things that had been done to him and to Elena, and then they never spoke of it again. The pain was simply too deep, too entangled with the fundamental wrongness of the entire situation. Elena herself stayed at Thornhill Estate until 1867. During those years after the war, she learned how to exist as a free person, though the psychological damage of her childhood never fully healed. She eventually moved to Savannah, where she worked as a seamstress and married a carpenter named William Foster. She never had any children of her own. She never spoke publicly about her mother or her horrific childhood. When she died in 1903, her obituary made absolutely no mention of Thornhill Estate or Burke County. Jonathan remained at the plantation longer, attempting to work the land with a small group of freed men who had stayed behind, but the cotton market was depressed. The soil was exhausted and depleted, and the property's dark reputation had begun to spread throughout the black community in Burke County. By 1869, Jonathan finally gave up and abandoned the estate. He drifted west, eventually settling in Texas under an assumed name. He died in 1891. And his few possessions included a small notebook where he had written over and over in a tiny, cramped script, "I did not choose this. I did not choose this. I did not choose this." Thornhill Estate itself decayed rapidly, almost as if it were cursed. The main house was partially destroyed in a suspicious fire in 1871. The remaining structures gradually fell into ruin. The land was eventually seized for unpaid taxes and sold at auction in 1878 to a timber company, which cleared the old growth trees and divided the property into smaller parcels. But in 1871, something was discovered that brought the entire story back into the public eye, at least briefly. A well driller working on a neighboring property accidentally broke through into an old cistern on what had once been Thornhill land. Inside the cistern, 30 feet below ground, was a skeleton. The remains were surprisingly intact, preserved by the cool, dry conditions. They belonged to a woman, likely in her 30s or 40s. Scraps of cloth suggested a dress from the 1860s. A corroded metal locket, discovered near the skeleton, contained 2 miniature portraits, a man and a young boy. The coroner in Westboro examined the remains and concluded that the woman had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The skeleton was buried in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. The official record identified the remains only as unknown female, discovered former Thornhill property 1871, but the people in Burke County's black community knew exactly who it was. The story had been passed down in hushed whispers in kitchens and churches, a coded language that protected those who had been present that night in March of 1864. They knew that Catherine Thornhill had been killed by the very people she had enslaved and brutalized. They knew that her body had been hidden in a deep well or cistern. They knew that justice of a kind had been served. Over the years, more information trickled out, though always in fragments, always incompletely. In 1889, a man on his deathbed in Alabama confessed to a minister that he had helped to murder his former mistress in Georgia during the war. He provided no name, no specific details, but the minister duly noted the confession in his records. In 1902, a woman in Savannah, Hope's granddaughter, wrote a short memoir that mentioned the night the devil mistress disappeared and nobody mourned her. The most damning evidence of all came to light in 1923, when a historian researching Burke County Civil War history discovered a cache of letters in the courthouse basement. Among them was a letter written in 1865 by Union Captain Samuel Reynolds, who had commanded one of the first federal units to enter Burke County after the war ended. Reynolds wrote, "We discovered disturbing evidence at a property called Thornhill Estate. Indications of systematic breeding experiments conducted by the late owner upon enslaved persons, including her own biological offspring. The details are too grotesque to relate in full. But multiple witnesses confirmed that the woman, one Catherine Thornhill, had implemented a program to create a self-perpetuating enslaved population by forced reproduction across generations. The witnesses also informed us that Mrs. Thornhill disappeared in March 1864, and though they would not explicitly state what occurred, their meaning was clear enough. I have elected not to pursue the matter further, as it seems to me that whatever justice was enacted upon this woman was well-deserved. I have directed my men to say nothing of what we learned here." The letter was filed away and promptly forgotten once again until a graduate student found it in 1954 while researching her dissertation on Reconstruction in Georgia. She attempted to verify the story, interviewing elderly residents of Burke County who might remember family stories from that era. Most claimed to know nothing. One woman, 93 years old, the great-granddaughter of one of the enslaved people at Thornhill Estate, said only some things happened that needed to happen. Some people did things that needed doing, and that's all that needs to be said about it. The final mystery of Thornhill Estate concerns the 23 children discovered locked in the basement when federal troops arrived. Captain Reynolds's official report mentions them, as do several letters written by soldiers in his unit. The children were freed and placed with freedmen families in Burke County and the surrounding areas. But what happened to them after that is lost to history. Some of them surely survived to adulthood. Some likely had children of their own, which means that there are probably people alive today, living in Georgia or elsewhere, who carry Catherine Thornhill's genetic legacy without even knowing it. They might be descended from Jonathan or Elena or one of the other children from the breeding program. They might carry some of those distinctive features, pale green eyes or auburn hair, sharp cheekbones, that mark Catherine's offspring. They would never know that their ancestor built her legacy on one of the most calculated systems of exploitation and cruelty in American history. Catherine Thornhill had somehow convinced herself that she was building something revolutionary, creating a new model for plantation management, securing her family's future. In reality, she was simply perpetuating and intensifying one of humanity's greatest evils. And the people she exploited, the people she bred and controlled and tormented, ultimately erased her from history as thoroughly as she had tried to erase their own humanity. What do you make of this story? Do you believe that everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried on that land in Burke County? The truth is, we may never know the full extent of what happened at Thornhill Estate. The people who lived through it, the survivors, chose to carry some secrets to their graves. And maybe they're right. Maybe some stories belong solely to the people who endured them, not to historians or storytellers like me. But we can honor those people by remembering that their resistance mattered, that their survival mattered, that they outlasted the system that was designed to utterly destroy them. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the hidden histories in your own community, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with someone who appreciates deep dives into America's darkest chapters. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge what you think you know about history. And remember, the past is never as far behind us as we'd like to believe. See you in the next video. In 1864, a truly disturbing discovery was made. 23 children were found locked away in the basement of a Georgia plantation. Each child shared striking similarities: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, and auburn hair streaked with gold, marking them as kin. When Union soldiers breached the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, what they encountered was a scene of utter despair. These children, some barely 4 years old, others on the cusp of adulthood, were huddled together in the oppressive darkness. The eldest, a girl of 13, spoke words that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened veterans. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." The incident was noted only fleetingly in military records, a single, confidential letter buried deep within the regimental archives of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, where it remained for over a century. Local histories of Burke County, for their part, acted as if Thornhill Estate had simply vanished, as if the plantation and its mistress had never existed at all. But they did exist, in the twisted endeavor that Catherine Thornhill embarked upon. During the 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of Union troops stands as one of the most horrifying chapters in American history. It was a systematic breeding program, carefully designed to create generations of enslaved people who could never escape their bondage, people who were genetically bound to their owner. Before we delve further into the story of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she unleashed in rural Georgia, I need you to do something. If this story is already sending chills down your spine, then hit that subscribe button right now. This channel fearlessly explores the darkest, most unsettling corners of American history, the stories that get conveniently left out of textbooks, the secrets that lie hidden in courthouse basements and forgotten military documents. And I'm curious to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment,